Welcome to Velvet Chronicles, where every secret changes destiny. Tonight's story begins. They hissed behind their painted fans that she was being sold to a man who would rather look at his valet than his own bride. Lady Seraphine Vane had heard every rumor about the Duke long before she ever met him. She expected a cold marriage of convenience, a locked bedroom door, and a lonely life drifting through the corridors of some vast, empty estate. She braced herself for a lifetime devoid of passion. But when the heavy oak door clicked shut on her wedding night, what the Duke did next shattered every rumor society had ever whispered and left her completely undone. The study smelled of stale gin, damp wool, and quiet ruin. Seraphine stood before her father's scarred desk, her spine rigid, her ribs aching against a corset laced too tight that morning by her mother's maid. She did not let the discomfort show. Weakness in this room was like bleeding in shark-infested water. Lord Vane did not look up from his ledger. He scratched his quill across another line of credit, a man long since bled dry. The Duke of Ravensmoor, he said, his voice a dry rasp. He has agreed to the settlement. Your debts, our debts, cleared by the end of the quarter. Seraphine stared at the bald patch on the crown of her father's head. Ravensmoor. The name tasted like ash. The papers are signed, he said, finally looking up, his eyes bloodshot from decades at the card tables. You will marry him within the month. She did not cry. She had stopped crying over her father's gambling when she was 14. Romance, she had learned early, was a lie sold in cheap novels to keep foolish girls compliant. Marriage was commerce, and she was the commodity, no dowry, but an old name and a face judged pleasing enough to buy her family's salvation. I understand, she said evenly. Her father blinked, surprised by her lack of hysterics. You know the talk, I presume. The rumors about the Duke's preferences. I am aware of them. He waved a dismissive hand. Gossip, meant to sell papers. But even if true, it works in your favor. You'll have his title, his wealth, his estates, and he'll ask very little of you in return. Produce an heir, and you'll be left entirely to yourself. A brilliant arrangement. Seraphine walked out, the study door clicking shut behind her. She leaned against the hallway wall and closed her eyes. Cassian Thorne, Duke of Ravensmoor. 10 years her senior, notoriously reclusive, the subject of London's most vicious drawing-room gossip. He had spent his 20s abroad in Florence, returning only when his elder brother died in a riding accident. Since taking the title, he attended the required functions and nothing more. He danced with no one, courted no one, and was frequently seen in the close company of a small circle of bachelor friends, a fact the Ton seized upon with ravenous delight. They said he hated women. They said he was unnatural. Seraphine didn't care. If he preferred men, he would never come to her room in a drunken, fumbling midnight visit the way she had watched her father do to her mother for years. A distant husband who paid the bills was more than she had ever hoped for. She met him 3 days later at a stifling assembly in Belgravia, the room a suffocating crush of silk and floral perfume. Her mother gripped her elbow hard enough to bruise. He's coming. Smile, for God's sake. Seraphine pasted on a flat, practiced smile and watched him cross the room. Cassian Thorne did not look like the flamboyant caricature the gossip sheets painted. He was tall, broad-shouldered beneath severely cut navy wool, wearing no ostentatious jewelry, his face sharp and deeply tired, dark hair threaded with early silver. He bowed perfectly. Lady Vane. Lady Seraphine. His voice was a low, rough baritone, like a man who rarely used it. Your Grace. She dropped into a flawless curtsy. Would you care to walk? He looked only at her. I would be delighted. They walked past the parting sea of aristocrats watching with undisguised fascination, the ruined lord's daughter and the notorious Duke. What a pair! On the terrace, the cool night air was a blessed relief. I detest these things, he said suddenly, staring into the dark garden. The feeling is mutual, Your Grace. He glanced at her, a faint crease between his brows. You needn't flatter me. I am well aware of the nature of our arrangement. Your father was quite transparent about your family's circumstances. And what of your circumstances, Your Grace? Why marry me when wealthier families would gladly turn a blind eye to gossip for a coronet? He turned fully to face her, his pale grey eyes studying her with a strange clinical intensity. You do not simper. And when you look at me, you do not look with fear or disgust. You look at me with absolute indifference. Is that what you want? Indifference. I want peace, he said, voice dropping. I want the matchmaking mothers to stop parading their daughters at me. I need a duchess to manage my household, and someone who will not expect a grand romance. You are in luck, Your Grace, she said dryly. I left my romantic delusions in the nursery. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the tension in his jaw eased. Then we understand each other perfectly. The engagement lasted 3 weeks, a whirlwind of humiliating extravagance paid for by his solicitors, and relentless gossip. Seraphine sat one afternoon in Lady Winslow's parlour, balancing a porcelain teacup while the other women circled like vultures. Such a sudden match, Lady Winslow purred. The Duke is so particular. He is a man of decisive action, Seraphine said smoothly. Decisive, yes, tittered another woman behind her fan, though one wonders where his decisions usually lead. I hear he spends an inordinate amount of time at his club, in the billiard room. With Lord Ashcombe. The implication hung thick in the air. Seraphine felt a flash of irritation, not because they insulted her future husband, but because of their smug, sheltered cruelty. These were women who lived in houses paid for by men who kept mistresses across town and struck their wives behind closed doors, yet felt superior over rumours that merely offended their delicate sensibilities. Lord Ashcombe is a renowned scholar of antiquities, she said, her voice dropping cold and flat. I believe the Duke shares his interest in Roman architecture. But if you'd prefer to imagine something more scandalous beneath the billiard table, Lady Winslow, please don't let me interrupt your fantasies. The room went dead silent. Seraphine set down her cup with a sharp clink. Thank you for the tea. I really must be going. When she returned home, a heavy parcel waited in the drawing room, no flowers, no poetry, just a first edition translation of Homer's Odyssey, bound in dark green leather. A note in sharp, jagged handwriting was tucked inside the cover. You mentioned your father sold your library. A house should not be without books. She had made the comment in passing during a stilted courting visit 4 days earlier, while he stared out the window. She had assumed he wasn't listening. A strange ache bloomed in her chest, which she pushed down immediately. It meant nothing. Still, when he arrived the next evening to escort her to the theatre, she thanked him. In the shadowed box, the heat of the crowd pressed the whalebone of her gown viciously into her ribs. Are you unwell? He asked, without looking away from the stage. Perfectly fine. He turned, scanning her rigid posture, the pallor of her face. You're not breathing. It is fashionable not to. It's barbaric. He shifted closer, the scent of him, cedar, clean linen, cold rain, washing over her. He reached behind her back, his warm hand resting briefly against the laces of her gown. Tomorrow, tell your modiste to loosen the stays by 2 inches. If she refuses, tell her I'll find a new one. Society will say I look sloppy. Let them say what they like. I'm already the deviant Duke. They can call you the sloppy Duchess. We'll be a menace to polite society together. A short, startled laugh escaped her before she could stop it. The corner of his mouth twitched upward, transforming his harsh face for a fraction of a second into something devastatingly human. Then it vanished, but she remembered it for the rest of the week, and the whispers of society felt a little less loud. Their wedding day dawned grey and unremarkable, a small, private ceremony at a quiet chapel, her father unable to afford anything grander and the Duke having zero interest in spectacle. Her mother fussed with her veil, hands trembling. Tonight, you know the rumours. If he doesn't come to your room, don't feel slighted. It may be a blessing. Men are beasts. If he leaves you be, simply go to sleep. I know, Mother. I expect nothing. The ceremony passed in a blur of archaic vows and echoing footsteps. Cassian stood beside her, smelling faintly of brandy, nervousness, she wondered, or liquid courage. His hand was ice cold as he slid the ring onto her finger, his voice steady, like a contract being read. They boarded the travelling carriage bound for Thornfield Hall, his ancestral seat in the northern hill country, a brutal 4-day journey. Rain streaked the windows as London gave way to muddy roads. Hours of thick silence passed. "You're shivering," he said finally, breaking the quiet like a gunshot. "Just the damp." He held out the edge of his wool blanket without argument. She hesitated, sharing it felt too intimate for two people who had essentially purchased each other, but the cold one. She slid across the bench, keeping a foot of space between them, and tucked the blanket over her legs. "Thornfield is drafty," he said, staring at the door handle. "Built for defense, not comfort. You'll need warmer clothes than London silk." "I am adaptable, Your Grace." "Cassian," he corrected softly. "If we're to share a house for the rest of our lives, you should use my name." "Cassian." It felt heavy on her tongue. "Then you must call me Seraphine." He nodded once, closing his eyes against the squabs. "The estate is isolated. No neighbors for 10 miles. The servants are quiet. It's a lonely place. I'm used to being alone." He opened one eye. Being lonely in a crowded room in London is different from being lonely in a stone fortress on the moor. "I won't keep you prisoner. If you wish to return for the season, I'll fund it." He was offering her an escape from his own life, a generous, decent thing. So why did it make her chest tighten? "I have no desire to return to London," she said truthfully. "I'm quite finished with society." He let out a long breath. "Good. Society is a disease." They arrived at Thornfield Hall 3 days later as the sun set behind jagged hills, a monstrous house of dark, brooding stone rising like a cliff face, narrow windows staring out like empty eyes. It terrified her. She thought it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The staff lined the entrance hall exactly as described, quiet, older, fiercely loyal, and looked at her not with disdain, but cautious, hopeful curiosity. "Show the Duchess to her rooms," Cassian instructed the stern housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt. "Draw a hot bath. She's exhausted." He did not look at Seraphine. "I'll be in my study. Good night." Her rooms were vast, done in rich burgundy and heavy oak, a fire already roaring. She bathed in lavender-scented water, mind entirely blank, the exhaustion of the journey finally catching up to her. She dressed in a simple white cotton nightgown, practical, high-necked, entirely unseductive. It didn't matter. She was safe. She was alone. She was the Duchess of Ravensmoor, and her life would be quiet, undisturbed, entirely her own. She pulled back the covers. Knock. Knock. Seraphine froze. The sound came from the connecting door, not loud, but thunderous in the silence. "Seraphine." His voice, muffled through heavy oak. Low. Hesitant. She stood, bare feet against cold floorboards, pulse roaring in her ears, and turned the brass handle. Cassian stood in the threshold, his formal coat discarded, wearing only a white linen shirt unbuttoned at the collar. Candlelight cast long shadows across the harsh angles of his face. Stripped of his aristocratic armor, he was simply a man, a very large, terrifyingly quiet man. "May I come in?" "Yes." He stepped inside, closed the door, set the candle down, and did not move toward the bed. He did not move toward her. He simply stood, hands deep in his pockets, staring at the floorboards between them. "My mother told me if you didn't come, I should just sleep," Seraphine started, her voice too thin. "She said it would be a blessing." His jaw clenched. "Your mother is a fool, but she was right to assume you'd prefer a locked door." "I didn't lock it." He looked up, his eyes catching the firelight, burning with sudden intensity. "Why?" Because you are my husband, she said, forcing the words out, refusing to tremble. We made a bargain. My father's debts are paid. I am yours to use as you require to secure the line. I know what's expected of me. He flinched, a minuscule tightening of his shoulders, and took a step forward. Is that what you think this is? A transaction? That I came here to use you. I think you are a duke. Dukes require heirs. I am not stupid, Cassian. Do what you must. I won't fight you. The silence that followed was absolute. Then he crossed the distance in 3 long strides. She braced herself, shutting her eyes, waiting for rough hands, tearing fabric, the crude weight she'd been taught to expect from men. Instead, warmth radiated against her face. She opened her eyes. He stood inches away, hands hovering beside her jaw, not quite touching, his chest rising and falling in harsh, uneven breaths. Look at me, he whispered. She looked. The rumors in London, he said, his voice a gravelly murmur, say I despise women. That I prefer the company of men in hidden rooms. That I'm cold, unnatural, devoid of feeling. They're half right. He let his hands finally rest against her cheeks, rough from riding but impossibly gentle. I am unnatural, because I look at men like your father, men who take mistresses, who treat their wives like breeding mares, who take whatever they want by force, and I feel nothing but violent disgust. Her breath hitched. I let the rumors spread, he confessed, thumbs tracing her jaw. It was the easiest way to keep the vultures away. If they thought me a deviant, the matchmaking mothers stopped throwing their daughters in my path. It gave me peace. But it was a lie. He stepped closer, his body radiating heat through the thin cotton of her gown. I do not despise women, Seraphine. I despise the women they tried to sell me. The falseness. The greed. He leaned down, forehead resting against hers. And then I saw you standing in a corner, looking at the entire room as if you wanted to burn it to the ground. Her lips parted, a tiny gasp escaping. I am not going to use you, he whispered, lips brushing hers with every word. I am not going to climb over you in the dark and take what I want and leave you crying into your pillow. If I touch you, it is because you asked me to. If I stay in this room, it is because you want me here. If you tell me to leave, I will go, and I will never cross that threshold again. He pulled back just enough to meet her eyes, the coldness gone entirely, replaced by something raw and vulnerable. The choice is yours, Seraphine. Tell me to leave. She stared at the man society called a monster, the man who had bought her, now offering her the one thing she had been denied her whole life, absolute control over her own body. The icy shell around her heart cracked down the center. She didn't speak. She reached up, fingers trembling, wrapping into the soft linen of his shirt, and pulled him down. When his mouth covered hers, there was no brutality, only a desperate, shattering reverence. He groaned, arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest, kissing her like a man starving, like someone who had spent his life in freezing dark and finally found the sun. He didn't rush. He stripped away her nightgown as if it were spun glass, following her down onto the bed. Tell me if I hurt you, he murmured against her neck. Tell me to stop. Don't stop, she breathed, fingers tangling in his silver-threaded hair. Please. The consummation of their marriage was not a transaction. It was a baptism. He mapped every inch of her with hands and mouth, drawing out soft, desperate sounds until she was entirely undone. When the moment of final consummation came, he stopped completely, holding perfectly still, muscles locked with restraint, whispering quiet, grounding praise against her skin until the tension broke and pleasure rushed in. Hours later, the fire burned to embers. Seraphine lay curled against his side, his arm anchoring her waist, listening to the steady thump of his heart. She understood now why the rumors had been so necessary. A man capable of this consuming devotion could not survive the shallow, vicious waters of London society. He would be eaten alive. The coldness was armor. Here, in the dark of Thornfield Hall, he had taken it off. For her. A single silent tear slipped down her cheek, soaking into his chest, not from sorrow, but from the terrifying realization that she was already helplessly in love with her husband. The next morning, the household woke to a seismic shift. Mrs. Pruitt had instructed separate breakfast trays per tradition, coffee for the Duke in his study, tea for the Duchess in her rooms. But when a young maid named Nora knocked timidly on the Duke's door, there was no answer. Panic rippled through the staff. Had he left in the night? Nora was sent to the Duchess's suite instead. She knocked, and a deep voice rumbled, "Come in." She pushed the door open and froze, the silver tray rattling in her hands. The reclusive Duke of Ravensmoor sat shirtless in the Duchess's bed, the new Duchess tangled in the sheets beside him, her head resting casually on his shoulder. "We'll take breakfast in the morning room, Nora," Cassian said. "Set 2 places, and tell Mrs. Pruitt to move my trunk from the east wing. I'll be residing in this suite permanently." Nora squeaked, bowed, and fled. Seraphine laughed, pulling the sheet over herself. "You've scandalized her. She'll survive. I refuse to sleep across the house from you like a polite stranger. Life is far too short for that particular misery." The news swept through Thornfield's stone corridors like wildfire. The rumors from London were violently, undeniably false. That afternoon the rain broke, the sky opening into a brilliant, brutally crisp blue. Cassian ordered 2 horses saddled. "You can ride?" he asked as they stood in the muddy courtyard, Seraphine in a heavy riding habit of dark green wool. "My father sold my horse at 16 to cover a debt at cards," she said evenly, pulling on leather gloves, "but I haven't forgotten how." His jaw tightened at the mention of her father, but he said nothing, simply gripping her waist and lifting her onto the saddle of a calm grey mare with effortless strength. They rode past the iron gates into the hills, a revelation of untamed, violent beauty to a woman raised believing the north was wasteland. Cassian rode ahead, watching the land with the keen, possessive eye of a hawk. Here, he looked neither tired nor cold. He looked like he belonged. They reached the crest of a high ridge overlooking a village nestled in the valley. "Tenants," he said, gesturing below. 180 families, sheep farmers mostly, a few weavers. "They rely on you," she noted. "Yes." He kept his gaze on the valley. "My brother Julian was meant to inherit all of this. He was the golden boy, gregarious, charming, loved the politics and the parties. I was the spare. Content to spend my life in a library in Florence, studying dead languages." It was the first time he had spoken of his brother. She stayed still, letting the wind pull loose strands of hair across her face, not wanting to break the fragile spell. Julian broke his neck taking offense on a hunt. "Drunk," Cassian said, flat and devoid of emotion. Suddenly the title was mine, the responsibilities, the debts he'd hidden, tenant starving because he'd squandered the estate's income on racehorses. He turned to look at her, wind tearing at his dark hair. "When I returned to London, they expected me to be Julian, to smile, to play their games. I couldn't. I hated them for dancing while my people here struggle to afford coal for winter. So I stopped talking to them. I spent my time with Ashcombe and a few other academics. The ton did what they do best, invented a story to explain what they couldn't understand. The rumors," she said softly. "I let them think I was a deviant, because a deviant is ignored. A grieving, angry man is managed. I refuse to be managed." He covered her hand on the pommel with his own. "I hid behind the gossip, Seraphine. It was cowardice." "It was survival," she corrected fiercely, turning her hand over to thread her fingers through his. "They are parasites. You starved them of the drama they craved. That is not cowardice. That is strategy." He stared at her, the rigid tension in his shoulders melting away, the phantom smile returning, this time reaching his eyes. "You," he murmured over the wind, "are exactly the Duchess I needed." A month passed. The rhythm of Thornfield settled into a steady heartbeat. Seraphine commandeered the estate ledgers, sitting for hours in Cassion's study while he worked across from her. Her father's ruthless gambling had inadvertently taught her an immense amount about accounting and the masking of funds. She applied that logic to the estate, finding leaks, streamlining supply chains for the tenant farmers, and funding repairs on 3 collapsed cottages before the first snowfall. Cassian watched her work with quiet, burning pride. The brooding, solitary Duke had vanished, replaced by a man who touched his wife's waist every time he passed her chair, who kissed the ink from her fingers, who read poetry to her in bed while storms battered the walls outside. They were happy. It was a terrifying, fragile thing. The outside world intruded on a dreary Tuesday in November when the post arrived from London. Among bills and estate business was a thick envelope in her mother's sprawling hand. Seraphine's stomach plummeted. She hadn't spoken to her parents since the wedding. Her father had his money, he had no further use for her. She sliced the seal. Seraphine, the season has begun and the whispers are unbearable. We assumed your isolation in the north was temporary exile, but your extended absence confirms the worst of the gossip. They say he has locked you away to hide his continued indiscretions. Lord Ashcombe was seen purchasing a ticket for the northern coach 2 days ago. If he is flaunting his perversions under your roof, you must return to London immediately. Do not be a martyr. Your father's debts are paid, you owe the beast nothing more. Play the wronged wife, society will welcome you back, provided you abandon him to his squalor. Burn this upon reading. Seraphine stared at the ink, the words writhing like venomous snakes. The sheer audacity, the suffocating cruelty of the world they'd left behind. They could not stand that Cassian had found peace. They needed him to remain a monster so they could feel righteous in their glittering, fake lives. Cassian walked in, shaking damp rain from his coat, a rolled architectural draft under one arm. He stopped at the sight of her face, his relaxed demeanor vanishing instantly. What is it? Seraphine looked at her husband, the man who had spent a month peeling away her armor, who kissed her spine in the dark, who cared more for freezing sheep farmers than the opinion of any prince regent. She walked to the hearth and dropped the letter onto the glowing coals without crumpling or tearing it. The parchment curled, blackened, and erupted into orange flame. Cassian stepped up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her head. Poison? Just London. It seems Lord Ashcombe is coming for a visit. He let out a surprised breath. Thomas is coming here in November? The man hates mud more than he hates the French. My mother believes he's coming to continue your scandalous secret affair behind my back, Seraphine said dryly. Cassian choked on a laugh, burying his face in her neck. God help us. He's terrified of women, horses, and open spaces. You'll have to entertain him. I am hiding in the stables. She turned in his arms, looking up into eyes now entirely clear of the shadows that had haunted him when they first met. Let them come, she said fiercely, cupping his jaw. Let Ashcombe come. Let the whole House of Lords come. If they want to find a monster in this house, I will gladly show them one. His expression shifted, humor fading into that deep, raw reverence that always made her breath hitch. You would fight them for me. I would burn their society to the ground for you, she whispered, pulling him down to meet her lips. It wasn't a promise born of romantic fiction. It was the grounded, cynical, unyielding truth of a woman who had finally found something worth fighting for. Lord Thomas Ashcombe arrived 3 days later looking as though he'd been dragged behind the coach rather than ridden inside it, a slight, thin man with spectacles perpetually sliding down his nose and a retreating hairline. I have crossed into the underworld, he announced to the echoing stone walls, shaking a dripping umbrella. Cassian, if you've lured me to this frozen hellscape only to murder me and hide my body in a bog, I beg you to do it quickly. A booming laugh echoed from the stairs. Cassian jogged down, clapping his friend on the back hard enough to make him stumble. Thomas, you survived the mud. Barely. I demand brandy, a vast quantity of it. His eye shifted past Cassian, landing on Seraphine, and he froze, offering a stiff, awkward bow. Your Grace. A profound honor. I apologize for my intrusion. I did write ahead, but the postal service north of the Thames is largely fictional. Seraphine studied this man, the supposed secret lover, the crux of the vicious rumors that had plagued her husband. He clutched a leather satchel to his chest like a shield, trembling from cold. He was not a threat. He was a brilliant, socially anxious academic terrified of her. Lord Ashcombe, she said warmly, Cassian has told me a great deal about your work on Roman aqueducts. I've had a fire lit in the blue guest room, and Mrs. Pruitt has tea and a very large decanter of brandy waiting. Thomas blinked behind his lenses. He told you about the aqueducts. I am eager to hear your theories on the mortar compositions, Seraphine lied smoothly, having only glimpsed the titles of letters stacked on Cassian's desk. The tension drained from Thomas's shoulders so fast he visibly sagged. Mortar? Yes. Fascinating subject, the volcanic ash, you see. Changes everything. Cassian caught her eye over his friend's shoulder, a look of absolute, undisguised devotion. Thank you. For 3 days, Thornfield filled with the sound of debate, the two men unrolling parchment maps across the study floor. Seraphine did not withdraw to a drawing room as society dictated. She sat with them, read her ledgers, occasionally correcting Thomas's atrocious calculations on supply costs. There was no illicit romance, no hidden glances. Only the comfortable, deeply platonic bond of two men who had found solace in ancient history when the modern world proved too cruel. But London was not finished with them. The storm broke on a Thursday, not rain, but a carriage bearing the crest of Viscount Halloway, a notorious fixture of the clubs, possessed of a small fortune, a loud mouth, and an insatiable appetite for the destruction of others' reputations. He claimed to be travelling north to inspect a newly acquired property and required shelter from a passing squall. A blatant lie, there were 3 inns between the main road and Thornfield. He was a spy sent to verify the rumours of Seraphine's misery and Cassian's deviance. Halloway swept into the parlour bringing the stale scent of London society with him. Ravensmoor, he drawled, and the lovely Duchess. A picture of rustic domesticity. How charming. And Lord Ashcombe. I'd heard you braved the wilds. Dedication to your scholarly pursuits, no doubt. The implication hung thick and vile. Cassian went rigid, fists clenching. Seraphine stepped smoothly in front of him, resting a restraining hand on his forearm, feeling the violent tension humming beneath his coat. She squeezed once, a silent command. Let me, Viscount Halloway, she said, her voice dropping into the flat, icy register she used for unruly tenants and bad debts. How fortunate you found us. I hear the roads near your new property are treacherous, particularly for a man accustomed to the smooth pavements of St. James. Halloway smiled, thin and predatory. Indeed. Though I see some of us prefer to isolate our investments far from the public eye. He looked around the dimly lit parlour with open disdain. A bit draughty, is it not, Your Grace? One hopes you are kept warm. I am perfectly warm. He leaned forward in mock sympathy. A brave face, Lady Seraphine. Your mother is quite frantic with worry. If you ever require a swift escort back to civilization, my carriage is at your disposal. He was offering her an escape under the guise of chivalry, while insulting her husband to his face. Seraphine did not flush. She walked slowly to the decanter and poured a glass. Tell me, Viscount. How is your sister? Halloway frowned, thrown by the shift. Lady Anne is well. And her husband, the Earl? I was reviewing some old financial columns recently. Is it true he lost the deed to their country estate in a card game last month, and has taken up permanent residence in the lodgings of an opera dancer? Halloway's face drained of colour. The room went deadly quiet. Thomas choked on his brandy, covering his mouth. I do not see how that is relevant, Halloway stammered, his veneer cracking. It is relevant, Seraphine said, stepping closer, eyes burning with cold fire, because society seems entirely comfortable with an earl bankrupting his family and abandoning his wife for a mistress. That is considered normal. Accepted. She took another step, he leaned back away from her. Yet my husband pays his debts. He oversees 180 tenant families, ensuring their roofs do not leak and their children do not starve. He reads Greek. He remains faithful to his vows. But because he does not wish to drink port and trade crude stories with men like you, he is labeled a monster. She pointed to the door. I suggest you use it before the squall worsens. Holloway stared at her, then at Cassian, expecting the Duke to rein in his wife. Cassian only crossed his arms, pale grey eyes gleaming with dangerous, absolute pride. You heard the Duchess. The door. Holloway fled. Moments later the front door slammed, followed by the frantic crunch of carriage wheels on gravel. Thomas lowered his hand from his mouth, staring at Seraphine with profound, almost religious awe. By God! She's terrifying. Cassian crossed the room, ignoring Thomas entirely, and cupped her face in his hands. You, he murmured, voice thick with emotion, are the most magnificent creature I have ever seen. I told you I would burn their society to the ground. You barely needed a match, he said, resting his forehead against hers. They'll be terrified of you now. Let them. As long as they leave us in peace. The rumors did change. Holloway, to save face, returned to London painting Seraphine not as a neglected bride but as a monstrous, tyrannical woman who ruled Thornfield with an iron fist and had the Duke entirely under her bewitching control. The gossip shifted from pity to fear. The letters from her mother stopped entirely. It was the greatest gift London could have given them. The heavy silence of winter gave way to a brutal, muddy spring. The moors turned vivid green, the air smelling of wet earth and new heather. Seraphine stood at the window of Cassian's study, pressing a hand into the small of her aching back. She was 6 months pregnant, exhausted, swollen-ankled, her once flat stomach now a heavy, uncomfortable weight, yet she had never felt more rooted to the earth. Cassian entered tracking mud across the rug, not caring, and stepped straight behind her, his warm hands pressing into the base of her spine with steady, perfect pressure. The new roof on the older cottage is finished, he said, and the lambings come early. It'll be a good spring. The accounts for the south acreage are perfectly balanced, she added, closing her eyes. We have a surplus this quarter. Because you negotiate with grain merchants like a highwayman, he said, amusement in his voice. They fear your ledgers more than my temper. They stood in comfortable silence, watching rain clouds gather over distant peaks. This was their marriage, not built on sonnets or ballroom declarations, but on balanced ledgers, repaired cottages, shared silence, and the fierce protective walls they had built against a world that never understood them. I received a letter from my father today, Seraphine said quietly. Cassian's jaw tightened against her hair. He wants money. Implies a streak of tragic luck at the tables. I'll instruct the solicitors to burn any further correspondence. I've already written my reply. I enclosed a copy of the estate's charitable donations for the quarter and told him that if he requires financial assistance, he's welcome to apply for a position as a stable hand at Thornfield. Though I warned him the hours are long, and the horses do not tolerate fools. A slow, devastating smile spread across Cassian's face, reaching his eyes with absolute joy. He slid his hands around to cup her swollen belly. Remind me never to cross you, Duchess. See that you don't. A sharp kick registered against his palm. He froze, breath catching, looking down at her stomach, then up at her, eyes wide with startling vulnerability. Restless today, Seraphine said softly, smiling. Or she, he corrected, voice thick, and dropped to his knees on the rug, pressing his face against her stomach, hands bracketing her hips with infinite care. She looked down at her husband, the man society called a cold, unnatural monster, kneeling on the floor, whispering quiet, reverent promises to a child not yet born. She ran her fingers through his silver-threaded hair, feeling the solid strength of him. They had pitied her once. She remembered the whispers, the smug faces of women who thought she was being sent to an icy tomb, women trapped in their own hollow marriages, desperate for approval from a society that would discard them the moment they showed a flaw. Let them keep their glittering ballrooms and poison tea. She had the moors. She had the stone fortress. And she had the absolute, undivided devotion of the Duke of Ravensmoor. She was exactly where she was meant to be. 5 years later, the heavy oak doors of Thornfield Hall stood thrown open to the summer breeze, the house no longer a silent tomb but echoing with running feet. A 4-year-old boy with his mother's sharp dark eyes and his father's chaotic silver-threaded hair sprinted across the entrance hall clutching a wooden sword, chased by a heavily out-of-breath Thomas Ashcombe, carrying a shield that looked suspiciously like a lid stolen from Mrs. Pruitt's stew pot. "Halt, you barbarian," Thomas panted, adjusting his spectacles. "Rome does not fall to a toddler." The boy shrieked with laughter, dodging behind a suit of armor. Seraphine watched from the study doorway, a ledger on her hip, dressed simply in comfortable muslin, the complex corsets of her youth long since abandoned. She looked older, sharpened by responsibility, but the weary cynicism of her London years was entirely gone. Cassian walked up behind her, smelling of horsehair and pine, wrapping his arms around her waist, chin on her shoulder, watching their son ambush a terrified scholar of antiquities. "Thomas is going to let him win again," he murmured. "Of course he is. Thomas is entirely subjugated. I believe our son now outranks him in the household hierarchy." Cassian chuckled, the vibration rumbling against her back, and pressed a lingering kiss to her neck. They stood together on the threshold of the life they had built, not forged in the fire of dramatic, sweeping romance, but in the quiet, unyielding iron of mutual respect. They had taken the worst of what society expected of them, a cynical transaction, a monstrous rumor, an isolated exile, and built an empire out of it. "Are you happy, Seraphine?" Cassian asked quietly. It was a question he asked often, in the quiet moments of the evening, as if he still couldn't quite believe she had stayed. She turned her head, catching his gaze, his pale grey eyes warm, anchored, entirely hers. "I am the most terrifying duchess in the north," she said, a smirk playing on her lips. "The accounts are balanced. The tenants are thriving, and London is far too frightened to send us visitors. I have everything I could possibly want." Cassian smiled, pulling her flush against him, burying his face in her hair. The heavy oak door of the study clicked shut behind them, sealing away the noise of the hall, but this time, not to hide from the world. They simply had no need of it anymore. They were already home.